What I'd like to share with you is our experience in NCIC of just one approach that we've adopted in response to supporting our staff through the past 12 months. And I want to share with you the pilot we undertook around team time, and then what our next steps are with that. So just to give a bit of context, if we go on to the next slide, Karen, I think from the backgrounds we all come from, whether you work in healthcare setting or social care setting or you're in primary care, I think you'll all be aware from the media and from how your teams are feeling themselves that the context of well-being of our staff wasn't necessarily optimum pre-COVID. What COVID has done has given us an amplification of that situation and opened up the wounds to be quite gaping. So nationally, we recognise there's higher levels of staff turnover and sickness. The health service particularly has absence running around 2.3% higher than other organisations. Depending where you are in the country, there's a shortage of staff in terms of clinical staff, nursing, medics, and obviously more recently we're starting to see impact on driver staff as well, so the ancillary staff that support the functioning of our health services. 50% of staff report debilitating levels of work stress. That's reflected across all care sectors, irrespective of where you work. And we also, unfortunately, have higher levels of allegations around bullying, harassment, discrimination, which doesn't fare well for the type of culture and setting that we operate in when we think of ourselves as caregivers and quality caregivers. So that's a bit of context where we were pre-COVID. The evidence, and there's links at the end of this presentation to take you to more detailed evidence should anybody wish to explore that, does suggest there's higher levels of stress and burnout and what we now term empathy fatigue within health and care staff setting than any other profession. That has been compounded over the past 18 months with the pandemic, but the forecast and modelling around that is going to get significantly worse before we get better. So in response to that, there's a number of health and wellbeing initiatives and recognition that our staff are our greatest assets. So how do we invest in the health and wellbeing of our staff? Some of that is our personal responsibility in how we need to look after ourselves and give ourselves the same compassion we afford to others. But some of that is around the organisations that we work in's responsibility as well to ensure we've got adequate environments, facilities and support available for us to do our roles to the best of our ability. Nobody comes to work to do a bad job. I don't believe that for 1 minute. And there's a lot of evidence. We'll move on to the next slide, Karen. There's a lot of evidence around to show that compassionate leadership leads to compassionate care in services. And I'd signpost you at this point to any of the Michael West evidence on the King's Fund website if you just wanted to Google that. And what we mean by compassionate leadership, and I would also say here it's not just about leadership. You don't need to be in an transparent leadership position. This to me applies to anybody, us as human beings really, how we can build compassion into our day-to-day behaviours. So there's 4 elements between the relationship of compassion and the behaviours that develop that compassionate environment, and they're attending, so that's being present with somebody or with the team or with the group of people you're talking to, whether this be on a one-to-one level, a team level. Having that understanding of what the individual or the group are saying. It's about what is their truth from their perspective, not what you might think's happening. We're all very good as human beings to have a judgment on situations. This is about trying to suspend that judgment and using questions to explore in a curious way to help you understand the perspective from where that person's sitting or that group. Empathizing, which isn't about corroborating or colluding or sympathizing. I think there's a lot of misperception about the difference between empathy and sympathy and compassion. And again, there's an excellent link I can share that shows the difference very succinctly. That's nice to watch, a Brené Brown link. But empathy is around walking alongside that person, just being present with them, not necessarily feeling you need to be in a problem-solving situation with them. And again, it's that understanding the situation from that individual's perspective. And then the next step that takes you towards that compassionate action is looking at the action that'll help serve that person or that team if that's wanted by the team. Sometimes just sitting, being with a person is sufficient. In healthcare, and I come from a clinical nursing background, so I'm speaking with very much experience here. We are hardwired and trained to problem solve, to sort, to fix, to make better. So this change in approach can feel quite clunky because it can go against our natural instinct to want to be kind and be doing for individuals, and sometimes that's actually not helpful. So team time and Schwartz rounds, what they're about is giving a space where these components are very much the ethos about how they operate. And the background to Schwartz and teams, if we just move on to the next slide, Karen, just share a little bit of history as to where Schwartz rounds have emanated from, because is an offshoot of Schwartz. Some of you have maybe heard of Schwartz rounds if you haven't heard of team time. So Schwartz rounds came from the legacy of a gentleman, Ken Schwartz, so you can see on the image there. Ken was a health attorney in America who sadly had terminal lung cancer in the late 90s. Now, during his treatment, he recognised the simple acts of kindness showed to him actually made that bearable unbearable. He was really interested in what made that difference to the situation he faced, which was obviously a very difficult situation for him and his family. And in his period of being an inpatient in hospitals and dealing with a lot of caregivers, he identified that there was a pattern of where staff were compassionate towards each other, they tended to show those acts of kindness towards him as a patient. And the legacy he wanted to leave was to give health and care staff that space to actually explore what is the impact of that continual emotional giving of yourself in the role you have. And that's where Schwartz rounds came from, and the programme was developed through an evidence base linked to those 4 elements of compassion. So if we just go on to the next slide, Karen. So the differences between Schwartz rounds and team time are that Schwartz rounds are, well, they're both a structured forum whereby staff, both clinical and non-clinical, and this is available for staff at all levels of an organisation, come together to discuss the emotional impact and social impact that their role has on them. So what it isn't is a problem solving forum or an action learning set where you're trying to work through a tricky problem and share experience of what might have worked. That's not that forum. This forum is about giving yourselves the space to look at what was the impact of that for me as a person, and the human contact that comes from that is quite powerful, and I'll share some results from our pilot shortly with you. So the purpose of the rounds is to understand the challenges and rewards that go alongside our roles, the intrinsic drivers that make us get out of bed every day to do our roles. So what is it about our roles that keep us motivated, that keep us coming back to do the same role day in, day out? Recognising we're in a very interesting phase in health and social care at the moment, in that we are dealing with the aftershock of the pandemic and also the fragility of the workforce that we had before the pandemic, that it's just illuminated. So what rounds do is help staff feel more supported in the job, giving them that time and space to reflect on the role. Evidence shows, and there's a lot of evidence from the Point of Care Foundation, who support us as an organisation with this, evidence shows that staff who've attended rounds report that they feel less stressed, less isolated, and actually they increase the appreciation of roles within the organisation and within teams. So within that, and by default, that helps reduce hierarchies within organisations and teams as well, because what people start to see is the human connectivity behind the role, so seeing the person behind the role. And I don't know if any of you have been party to Schwartz rounds or a team time session, but they are very, very powerful spaces to be part of, and to recognise that actually strip the role and the title off. We are all human underneath this uniform we wear day in, day out. So team time is an offshoot of Schwartz, based on exactly the same principles of that safe space to explore the impact of your role, and that's done through a storytelling approach. So there'll be 2 or 3 storytellers who will share their story of an agreed title. So as part of our response within North Cumbria Integrated Care Trust to the situation we've had recently with COVID, and where staff were in terms of how it was making staff feel in the team, we had a headline title of COVID and Me. So we've run a number of sessions for teams around that title. And so storytellers who are self-selected storytellers as part of that team share their story from their perspective in relation to that title. And then we open up the conversation as a group, a facilitated conversation, to check in resonance, impact, how that makes others feel, anything people can relate to, but we move away from any problem solving approach. So it offers teams that team space to come together, the reflective space, and the predominant difference between team time and Schwartz rounds are there's 2 things. Schwartz rounds are organisational level and tend to focus on an event past. So an example of that is we've held Schwartz rounds in leadership forums and open events around medicine safety, around being new in role, the impact of moving into a more senior position, managing priorities. So they're things that cut across an organisation. Team time focuses on things that are current, so what it might be like now, and the team is defined by the immediate team you work with. So rather than them be large scale, they tend to be much smaller. The other difference is these operate online, although we have done them both online and face-to-face. It is a 45-minute reflective space, and we keep very much to that schedule of time. It's a very structured approach. So if we move on to the next slide, Karen, and what I'm going to share with you now is we piloted this approach over the period of May to April this year, so May 19 to April 20, to test this out to see if it was something that would be viable as an approach within our organisation. So we had 30 referrals from various teams across the board requesting referrals. We undertook a diagnostic conversation with those teams to establish whether team time was actually the right approach, or was it something else that the team might need, or was there some individual one-to-one support needed for individuals, because you'll recognise that this space can be quite whilst we create psychological safety, it can be very, very emotive and very triggering for people who may have gone through quite traumatic situations. So we have built in an additional step of the diagnostic conversation, and that's been really, really useful, because what that helped us identify that we actually followed through on those 30 referrals with 18 team time sessions. Rather than 30, the other 12 were signposted and directed to other support. And then we've also offered some additional follow-ups for those teams, because they are generally a one-off session, but we do offer up to 2 follow-ups with teams if invited to take up that. We started off with 4 facilitators last year. We now, through additional funding, have funding to train 24 facilitators. So we have recently just trained an additional 13 facilitators. So we are looking at launching this out as a programme offer to embed throughout the organisation as a result of the pilot. So if we just move on to the next slide, Karen, and I'll share with you the findings from the pilot, which very much echoed the wider large-scale evidence that the Point of Care Foundation share, and that is that the red word cloud here depicts the emotional impact that staff shared that COVID had on them. So all these team time sessions were designed around the heading of COVID and me. So these were the emotions that working in that environment generated for staff, and the impact for both them individually, emotionally, and their family life and socially. The green word cloud shows the impact in the follow-up that the team time session had for those individuals. And what came through very consistently was that realization that what the emotion people were feeling was normal. So what that team time space offered was normalization of emotion that individuals expressed that felt wasn't normal, or they felt inferior for thinking this way or feeling certain things. So it actually normalize that emotion for them, and through that brought about that connectedness to one another. So on that very human level, they felt more connected as a team, and through that connectivity came increased compassion towards each other, an appreciation of what individuals were going through, rather than perhaps assumptions that had formerly been made for people. So with that came a sense of relief that I'm not alone in this. I'm not, I'm not mentally ill or psychologically ill. This is a relief to know that actually what I'm dealing with is a normal reaction emotion to a traumatic situation. And actually there is that support there for us and for me as an individual. Some individual team members did accept the offer of having some one-to-one support following team time, and we've had a couple of teams who've come back for some further team time sessions, but the pilot was very powerful in identifying the benefits of that space and that time. Can we just move on to the next slide, Karen,
just
please?
Heads up, Elaine, just one more minute really to allow us time to do questions and wrap up.
So the next steps for us, and I do recognise we've got colleagues on this call from outside the NCIC organisation, and this is an approach that's internal to NCIC as part of a licence we have, but we are working across the North East with CNTW and Newcastle in looking at how we can organise Schwartz rounds across organisations, because they are licence holders as well with point of care. So the organisation in NCIC have invested in a dedicated resource to develop the model, in that my role is invested. That's how my role came about. We've trained additional facilitators, and we're now at a point of launching this as a programme offer into the organisation. And finally, the last slide, Karen. Wellbeing is everybody's business. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, but that can be really difficult when individually and as groups we're all sort of grappling with a number of conflicting priorities. I'll hand over for any questions, but there is a final slide with various links in if people want more information. I'm more than happy to be contacted outside of this forum as well if people would like to pick up a conversation and explore in a bit more detail. And for those staff who are in NCIC, if you would like to have a team time session, please do get in touch with me and we'll look at having that diagnostic conversation to see if it's appropriate or not. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elaine. That was great. Thank you very much. That was a great overview of all the hard work you've been doing. I'm going to ask now if anybody's got any questions, but we did have one while we were going, and it was how do you decide on topics for these sessions?
Good question. Yeah, so there is a Schwartz and Team Time steering group who have come up with a number of topic headings to put out there as part of the promotion to give teams ideas on, but teams through the diagnostic conversation tend to come forward with what's going on in the team. The conversation is around what's happening for the team at the moment, so we tend to collaboratively come up with a topic heading through that diagnostic conversation. But there can be on anything, so we've had them on a patient you'll never forget, a situation that didn't go to plan. You know, it can be on anything, literally.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.